My beloved child. Do not move past this moment too quickly. Something about what you are about to hear was meant to reach you when your heart was finally quiet enough to recognize it. There are moments when a person can carry a question for so long that they begin searching for answers in places they never expected to visit, and your special person has been carrying such a question about you. They tried to reason with it. They tried to dismiss it. They tried to convince themselves that time would make the feeling disappear. But something inside them refused to let your presence become ordinary. And that is why, recently, they found themselves sitting across from someone they believed might see what they could not understand on their own. Your photo was there. Your face was there. And the moment it was placed before that psychic, the atmosphere of the conversation shifted in a way your special person had not prepared themselves for. They did not go there because they had forgotten you. They went because forgetting you had become harder than admitting how deeply you still affected them. That is the first truth being uncovered. What looked like curiosity was actually emotional restlessness. What looked like a simple question was carrying months, perhaps years, of feelings they had never completely put into words. They wanted somebody to explain why your memory could return during quiet moments without warning. Why certain songs still made them think of you. Why they could be surrounded by people and suddenly feel as though something important was missing. They wanted an answer that would make everything simple. Instead, what they heard made the connection feel more complicated, more meaningful, and impossible to dismiss. Your special person had expected vague words. They expected something they could smile at, forget, and leave behind when they walked out of the room. But that was not what happened. The psychic looked at your photograph longer than expected. There was a silence. Not the dramatic kind that belongs to fear, but the strange kind that arrives when someone is trying to choose their words carefully. Your special person immediately became more alert. They leaned forward. A small nervousness entered their chest because suddenly this was no longer entertainment to them. Something about the expression on the other person's face made the question feel serious. And then came the first sentence that changed the direction of everything. The psychic did not begin by describing your appearance. They did not begin by talking about dates, predictions, or fantasies. Instead, they said something that touched the very reason your special person had come there in the first place. They said that the person in the photograph seemed connected to a chapter that had never emotionally reached its true ending. Your special person froze. They had told themselves many times that whatever existed between you had already been defined by circumstances, distance, silence, misunderstanding, or timing. Yet here was someone looking at nothing but your picture and describing the exact feeling your special person had been trying to escape, unfinished. And understand this carefully, my child. Whether one believes in psychics or sees such moments simply as mirrors for hidden emotions, what matters in this story is what the words awakened inside your special person. The power was not in proving the future. The power was in forcing them to face the present truth of their own heart. Something they had buried suddenly stood in front of them without disguise. They could no longer pretend they had come because they were merely curious. They had come because part of them wanted permission to admit that you still mattered. The psychic continued slowly, almost as if sensing that every new sentence was landing somewhere tender. They said there seemed to be a great difference between what your special person had shown outwardly and what they had felt privately. That sentence struck deeper than the first. Your special person remembered moments when they had acted indifferent even though they cared. Moments when they had delayed a message because they did not want to appear vulnerable. Moments when pride spoke louder than affection. Moments when they let silence become a shield because saying what they truly felt would have required courage they did not yet possess. Suddenly the room was no longer about you alone. It became a mirror reflecting them back to themselves. They started remembering conversations differently. A sentence you once said returned with a new meaning. A look you gave them suddenly seemed less ordinary. A moment when you pulled away no longer looked like rejection but perhaps exhaustion. Your special person had spent so much time interpreting everything through their own fears that they had never fully asked what you might have been carrying too. And this realization did not make them feel condemned. It made them feel awake. Then the psychic said something your special person had not expected at all. They said, "You may have misunderstood their silence." Those words entered the room like a door opening. Your special person immediately thought of one particular period between you. There had been a time when something changed. Communication became different. Energy shifted. Perhaps one of you became quieter. Perhaps life became complicated. Perhaps something was assumed but never spoken. Whatever happened, your special person had created a story around that silence. They convinced themselves you had stopped caring, moved on emotionally, or decided they were not important enough to fight for. And because they believed that story, they responded to it as though it were fact. But what if they had been wrong? That question stayed in the air. My child, this is where something important begins. People often do not lose connection because love disappears. Sometimes they lose connection because fear writes a false interpretation and neither person knows how to challenge it. A delayed message becomes rejection. A tired voice becomes disinterest. A need for space becomes abandonment. Pride turns confusion into distance. And before either person understands what happened, two hearts are standing on opposite sides of a misunderstanding that neither one intended to build. Your special person began seeing this possibility. They remembered the last time you seemed different around them. They remembered how quickly they reacted internally. They remembered telling themselves, "I knew it. They never cared as much as I did." But sitting there with your photograph between them and a stranger, another possibility appeared. Maybe you had been protecting yourself. Maybe you had been waiting for reassurance that never came. Maybe you believed they were the one withdrawing. The realization was uncomfortable because it meant the story they had repeated to themselves might not have been complete. And then the psychic asked a question. Why did you bring this particular photo? Your special person looked down. That question should have been easy. Yet they could not answer immediately. There were many photographs they could have chosen. But they had chosen one where something about your expression stayed with them. Perhaps there was softness in your eyes. Perhaps you were smiling naturally. Perhaps the picture reminded them of a version of you that existed before tension entered the connection. They had selected it almost unconsciously, but when asked why, they realized it was because that photograph carried a feeling. It reminded them of the way they once saw you before everything became complicated. And that was when their emotions began shifting again. They said quietly that the photograph felt like the real you. Notice that, my child. They did not say the best photo. They did not say the most beautiful photo. They said it felt real. There is something sacred in being remembered not simply for appearance but for essence. Your special person was not searching for your image. They were searching for the feeling connected to who you were around them. They wanted to understand why that feeling had stayed alive long after circumstances suggested it should have faded. The psychic looked at the picture once more and said that perhaps the answer was not about predicting whether you would return, but understanding why your special person had never emotionally stopped turning toward you. That changed everything. Until that point, your special person thought they had gone there to discover something about you. Instead, they were being asked to understand themselves. Why had they never stopped wondering? Why did they still imagine conversations with you? Why did certain memories still carry emotion? Why had they compared new people, new experiences, and new connections to something they once felt with you? Why, after all this time, was your photograph still important enough to place before a stranger and ask, "What do you see?" Those questions followed one another until your special person could no longer hide behind curiosity. They cared. More than they had admitted. Perhaps more than they had even understood. And here is where the story becomes even more unexpected. Your special person began talking. Not because the psychic demanded details, but because the emotional door had opened. They spoke about how things had been between you. They described your personality. They mentioned something small you used to do that nobody else would consider important. Maybe the way you listened before answering. Maybe the way you remembered details. Maybe the way your face changed when you were trying not to laugh. Maybe the calm you brought into a room without realizing it. The more they spoke, the more obvious something became. They did not remember you vaguely. They remembered you intimately. There is a difference. Vague memories belong to people who have become part of the past. Intimate memories still carry texture. They still have sound, movement, expression, atmosphere. Your special person remembered not only what happened with you but how it felt. And then they stopped speaking mid-sentence. Because they realized the psychic was smiling gently. Not mockingly. Not mysteriously. Simply knowingly. Your special person asked why. The answer was simple. You're describing someone you still care about. No prediction. No dramatic claim. Just the truth. And strangely, that truth affected them more than anything supernatural could have. They looked away because something inside them had been exposed. For so long they had controlled the narrative. They told friends they were fine. They told themselves they had moved forward. They filled their days with responsibilities, distractions, new conversations, and plans. Yet one question from a stranger had stripped away all the complicated explanations. They still cared. The silence after that sentence felt different from the silence before it. Before, your special person had been waiting for information. Now they were facing a decision. Because once you admit that someone still matters, you cannot return completely to pretending they do not. That was the true message they heard. But it was only the beginning. The psychic then said something about you that made your special person sit completely still. They said the person in the photo appeared to have changed through whatever happened between you. They suggested that pain had not made you colder but more careful. That you might still carry warmth, yet you no longer give it away as easily. Your special person immediately understood what that meant. They began remembering ways you had tried. Perhaps you were the one who reached out more often. Perhaps you offered patience repeatedly. Perhaps you forgave moments that hurt. Perhaps you waited for them to become emotionally honest. Maybe you gave signs that you wanted reassurance, but your special person did not know how to respond then. And suddenly they wondered something they had avoided for a long time. What if you had not stopped loving them? What if you had simply stopped chasing clarity from someone who would not provide it? That possibility struck hard. There is a difference between losing interest and choosing self-respect. Your special person may only now be beginning to understand that difference. They imagined you walking away, not because the connection meant nothing, but because waiting had become painful. They imagined you trying to make peace with questions they themselves had helped create. And for the first time, instead of viewing the story entirely through what they had lost, they started considering what you might have endured. This is where regret entered the room. Not dramatic regret. Not despair. Something quieter. The kind that sounds like, "I should have said something." The kind that whispers, "I wish I had understood sooner." The kind that remembers an old conversation and realizes the right words had been there all along but were never spoken. Your special person asked the psychic if they thought you still felt anything. The psychic paused. And what they said next mattered. They did not promise love. They did not claim certainty. They said, "That is something only they can answer." My child, do you understand the beauty hidden in that moment? Your special person had arrived hoping someone else could tell them what was inside your heart. Instead, they were reminded that real connection requires courage, not prediction. If they wanted truth, perhaps eventually they would need to speak to you. Not through signs. Not through assumptions. Not through friends. Not through readings. Through honesty. That idea frightened them more than anything the psychic could have predicted. Because asking you directly would create a possibility they had avoided for a long time. You might answer. And your answer could change everything. Your special person suddenly understood why they had searched everywhere except the one place where truth actually lived. Asking a stranger felt safer than opening their heart to you. Wondering felt safer than knowing. Imagining what you might say allowed them to remain in control. Contacting you would require surrendering that control. And so they asked another question instead. What if too much time has passed? The psychic looked at your photograph and then at them. The answer was quiet. Time changes people. But sometimes it also makes them finally understand what they were too afraid to understand before. Your special person did not speak for several seconds. Because those words described exactly what was happening. Time had changed them. They were no longer the same person who reacted the way they once did. Experiences had humbled them. Relationships, disappointments, lonely evenings, conversations with others, and moments of self-reflection had taught them things they did not know when you were close. They now understood that vulnerability is not weakness. They understood that love cannot survive only on unspoken expectations. They understood that being cared for is not something to test endlessly. They understood that silence can wound just as deeply as harsh words. And perhaps most painfully, they understood that some people do not leave because they stopped caring. They leave because they finally begin caring about themselves too. That thought brought you back into their mind with extraordinary clarity. Whether life had made you stronger. Whether you still smiled the same way. Whether you still remembered them occasionally. Whether hearing their name would bring warmth, pain, indifference, or some complicated mixture of all three. Their curiosity was no longer casual. It had become longing mixed with uncertainty. And then came the moment that truly changed the emotional atmosphere. The psychic asked your special person to stop thinking about what you might feel and answer one question only. If they were sitting here right now, what would you want them to know? Your special person went silent. That question found the place inside them where all the unsent words had been waiting. For several moments, they could not speak. Then, slowly, something began coming out. They said they would want you to know that they never meant for things to become so confusing. They would want you to know that some of their distance had been fear, not lack of feeling. They would want you to know that they replayed certain moments more than they had ever admitted. They would want you to know that they sometimes wondered whether they had lost something rare because they did not understand its value while it was close. And then their voice changed. Because the next sentence was harder. They said, I would want them to know I was wrong about some things. That confession did something to them. It made everything real. People can survive for years inside pride as long as they never speak the truth aloud. But the moment truth becomes sound, it begins rearranging the heart. Your special person had finally admitted that their version of the story may have been incomplete. They admitted that fear influenced their choices. They admitted that you mattered. And then came the sentence they did not expect themselves to say. I think I still miss them. The room became very quiet. Your special person looked at your photograph. And for the first time during that entire visit, they were no longer asking the psychic anything. They were listening to themselves. My child, perhaps this is why this moment needed to happen. Not because another person held magical authority over your future, but because your special person needed something that would break through the walls they had built around their own emotions. They needed a situation in which they could no longer hide behind distraction. They needed to hear themselves say what their heart had been repeating silently for too long. You mattered. You still matter. And whatever happens next, that realization cannot easily be undone. But something else happened before your special person left. Something they have not told anyone. They picked up your photograph. They looked at it longer than they normally would allow themselves to. The psychic had already moved on from the reading, perhaps gathering things or preparing to end the conversation. But your special person remained focused on your face. And a memory returned. A specific memory. One that changed their expression instantly. It was not one of the obvious memories. Not a dramatic argument. Not a goodbye. Not some major event. It was something small. A moment when you said something to them that they did not understand at the time. Perhaps you said, "One day you'll understand." Perhaps you said, "I can't keep proving how I feel." Perhaps you said, "I hope someday you see what I was trying to give you." Whatever the words were, their meaning had finally caught up with them. Your special person suddenly realized that you may have understood the connection more clearly than they did back then. That idea followed them out of the room. It followed them into the street. It followed them home. And later, when they were alone, something happened that surprised even them. They opened their phone and searched for you. Maybe they looked at your profile. Maybe they opened an old conversation. Maybe they searched your name and then hesitated before doing anything else. Their thumb stayed near the screen. A message existed in their mind. They could almost see the words. "Can we talk?" Simple. Terrifying. Life-changing in its own quiet way. They typed something. Deleted it. Typed again. Deleted again. Because now the psychic's message was no longer the mystery. The mystery was what your special person would do with what they had realized. Would they continue hiding behind silence? Would they convince themselves tomorrow that the emotions were temporary? Would fear win again? Or would this become the moment everything between you began changing direction? They stared at the empty message box for a long time. And then something even stranger happened. Before they could decide what to write, a notification appeared on their phone. Not from you. But it mentioned something connected to you. Something that made them sit upright instantly. Something that seemed impossible to ignore after the conversation they had just experienced. And when they opened it, they saw one detail that made their heart begin pounding, because suddenly they were no longer wondering whether the past was trying to teach them something. They were wondering whether a door they thought had closed was quietly beginning to open again. And the message they almost sent you was still sitting unfinished in their mind when they noticed one final thing on the screen, something that changed what they were about to do next.